Forget everything you think you know about medieval armor. In 1415, French knights wore a custom-fitted steel shell that modern experiments prove was practically invincible to a single arrow. So how did a starving, outnumbered band of English longbowmen turn their impossible battle into the worst slaughter in French history? The answer isn't in courage, it's in the unseen physics of mud, wood, and steel. Henry V was a king of boundless ambition who had pushed his luck too far. By October of 1415, his English army was a sick, starving, and exhausted remnant, cut off deep in hostile France. What was left was an army of roughly 6,000 men, half of whom were longbowmen. They were facing a French force of between 25,000 and 30,000, an impossible 5-to-1 advantage. The French nobility, arrogant and impatient, saw not a battle to be fought, but a simple and profitable execution of the foreign king. They were so confident that many spent the night arguing over who would get to ransom the captured English nobles, convinced the fight would last no more than an hour. The immense host was a dizzying spectacle of silk banners, polished metal, and flashing gold. The men of the English army were not only outnumbered but psychologically shattered. They had recently endured the brutal siege of Harfleur, a victory which had cost them more men to disease the dreaded dysentery or the flux than to French swords. They were running low on rations, miles from the friendly port of Calais, and knew that the French had them trapped. The air was heavy with the smell of wet wool, fear, and sickness. Yet, in this moment of utter desperation, Henry V, cornered, chose his ground with the eye of a predator. The battlefield was a narrow chute of open ground, only about 900 yards wide, nestled between two dense woods, a tactical defile known in military terms as a choke point. This natural feature was his only salvation. It completely negated the French advantage in numbers and cavalry, forcing their massive host to condense into a narrow, brutal funnel. The French knew this field was a weakness, but their pride demanded they attack now, preventing the English escape and claiming all the glory. The dense trees on the flanks created a clear boundary, forcing the entire weight of the French vanguard to move through a relatively small, confined space. Then came the rain. The night before the battle, a heavy storm descended, soaking the newly ploughed fields between the woods. For the French, this was a catastrophic meteorological event, a curse delivered by the heavens. The ground was transformed into a thick, clinging, clay-heavy mud, churned into a heavy porridge by the thousands of marching feet and horses that had traversed it. It was so sticky it would suck the boots and hobnails right off a man's feet, making every step an exhausting effort. The French knights would rise the next morning to face an enemy who had nothing left to lose, on a field that would negate the very advantages their wealth and arms were supposed to grant them. They were about to pay the price for their supreme confidence in their numbers. Henry V's plan was simple: place his few professional men-at-arms in the center and flank them with the longbowmen, who would shoot diagonally into the approaching mass. He was preparing to meet the most powerful, most technologically advanced soldiers in Europe, a literal steel wall of knights. The French were confident their plate armor would make them untouchable. To understand the miracle of Agincourt, you must first understand the nearly unbreakable object the English were about to face. The knights of 1415 were not the clumsy figures of Hollywood legend. The French noblemen were clad in some of the finest bespoke plate armor in the world, often crafted by master smiths in Milan or in the burgeoning German Gothic style. This was the pinnacle of medieval personal defense, a military investment comparable to a modern fighter jet. The total weight of a complete suit of plate armor, including the complex mail underlayers, was generally between 50 and 70 pounds, distributed evenly across the entire body. Modern biomechanical tests confirm that a trained knight, due to this weight distribution, could run, spring to his feet, and fight without significant physical constraint in normal conditions. Mobility was one of its defining features, allowing the wearer to perform complex maneuvers, a far cry from the metal cans often depicted in film. Their freedom of movement was a testament to the sophistication of 15th century European engineering. The armor's primary engineering genius was its curvature and hardness. The plates were expertly rounded and angled, designed to turn aside or deflect any direct blow from a sword, pike, or lance, causing the weapon to glance off without transferring its full force. The breastplate, typically the thickest part, was often proofed through precise quenching and tempering, meaning it was tested against a crossbow bolt or even a handgun shot to ensure its resilience. The sheer cost and time required to forge such a suit meant it was accessible only to the richest elite, making the French front line an almost literal wall of expensive, custom-designed steel, shimmering under the pale October light. The French believed this wall could withstand anything the English could throw at it, secure in the knowledge that their armor was made of the highest quality steel available in Europe. The English longbowmen were facing a tactical problem of monumental scale. The armor was strongest where it needed to be: the breastplate, the leg guards, and the helmet. However, no suit of armor is perfectly continuous. Weak points were a necessary trade-off for movement and visibility. These included the small mail gussets worn under the armpits, the flexible joints at the elbows and knees, the gap where the visor met the gorget, neckpiece, and the ocularia or eye slits themselves. A knight who moved into the attack was constantly creating and closing these tiny, fatal gaps. The English understood that hitting the armor meant failure, but hitting the joints meant victory. The failure at Agincourt would not be a failure of metallurgy, but a catastrophic failure of tactics, environment, and volume of fire. The French believed the English could not penetrate their steel wall, which was mostly true in a one-on-one scenario. Their arrogance prevented them from seeing the strategic disaster unfolding. But the French had planned for knives and swords. They had not planned for what the English could do with a simple stick of yew wood. We need to dive into the technical details of the force that would soon challenge this steel supremacy. The longbowmen were not an appendage to the army. They were the engine of war, and their simple weapon was anything but primitive. To understand the longbow's power is to understand the archer's sacrifice. This was not a weapon you picked up on a Saturday afternoon. To master the longbow, which was typically made from the finest Italian or Spanish yew wood, using the hard heartwood for compression and the softer sapwood for tension, required decades of physical dedication starting in childhood. Henry V's archers were a breed apart, exhibiting unique physical signs. Skeletal analysis of remains reveals enlarged muscle attachment points and curvature of the shoulder and forearm bones, a physical record of the enormous, repetitive stress placed on the body by the draw. They were professional athletes of their age, developed through King Edward III's decree forcing all men to practice archery on Sundays. The average draw weight of a war bow in this period was massive, ranging from 80 to well over 100 pounds, with some documented bows pushing up to 120 pounds or even more. The archers used their entire body weight, leaning into the draw to fully bend the thick stave. The longbow effectively functioned as a supercharged compound spring, storing a colossal amount of potential energy, often measured in over 100 joules. This energy, released in a fraction of a second, launched the arrow with devastating kinetic force, capable of reaching velocities of over 180 feet per second. The arrow's flight path was designed not for long-range lobs, but for flat, destructive trajectories when the enemy closed. The longbow shaft itself was often over a yard in length and thicker than many modern target arrows, contributing significantly to the kinetic energy transfer. The archers deployed three main types of arrowheads. The broadhead was effective against unarmored targets like horses and light infantry, designed to cause massive hemorrhaging. But the true terror for the French was the bodkin point. This was a specialized, narrow, square-sectioned spike of hardened steel, designed not for cutting, but for concentrating all the kinetic energy of the bow into the smallest possible point of contact. Its purpose was singular: to exploit weaknesses, to punch through mail, and to defeat thinner plate at its weakest joints through sheer force per square inch. It was the medieval equivalent of a specialized armor-piercing round. The longbow's most critical tactical advantage, however, was its rate of fire. Unlike the slow reload time of a crossbow or a handgun, a trained longbowman, using a rhythm of drawing, aiming, and releasing, could achieve a rate of between 10 and 12 aimed shots per minute. This volume of fire was unprecedented. With Henry V fielding between 5,000 and 7,000 archers, the English could unleash an initial storm of over 60,000 arrows in the first minute of fighting. It was not a precise surgical strike, it was a deluge, a constant, whistling hailstorm of death that the French had no organized counter for. This was the true engine of the English victory, a high rate of fire area weapon designed to cause mass suppression and chaos. The French called it cowardly. But when the first volley hit, they learned it was simply physics operating at maximum lethality. As the French prepared their charge, the archers made their final preparation, hammering pointed wooden stakes or palings into the muddy ground before their line. These stakes, angled forward like a defensive hedgehog, were not a mere barrier, they were an anti-cavalry trap, designed to impale or severely disrupt any horse charge and protect the vulnerable archers from being overrun. The English army was ready, a thin line of desperate men and a technological marvel of medieval engineering. When the first command rang out, the question would be answered. Could the concentrated, brutal energy of yew and sinew succeed where swords and lances failed against the thickest, most advanced steel in Europe? The moment of impact would reveal the physical limitations of even the strongest armor. The first command rings out, and 5,000 archers draw back, their shafts blotting out the light. The sound of the initial release, a loud, rushing whistle followed by a terrifying collective thud, was deafening. When the first volley crashes into the ranks of French plate, what actually happens? This is the core question. Did the arrows simply bounce off, or did the kinetic energy of yew and sinew succeed where swords failed? This is where the physics, the pathology, and modern testing give us the true answer. The opening volleys of the battle were a terrifying, concentrated spectacle. The French vanguard began its advance, a massive wall of men-at-arms walking or trotting forward. When the first arrow storm hit, the chaos was immediate. The thickest, perfectly curved breastplates often survived the direct impact of a bodkin point from long range. The arrows simply ricocheted off the polished surface, sometimes snapping the shaft, but rarely penetrating the core defense. The myth that the longbow made plate armor obsolete in a single day is a simplification that ignores the complexity of the armor's design. However, the French formation was instantly compromised. Pathological studies and modern armor penetration tests clarify the true mechanism of the longbow's success. The arrows did not need to pierce the main plate to inflict lethal injury. They needed to exploit geometry and physics. The vast majority of wounds were focused on the gaps and seams, the armpit mail, the joints, and the narrow eye slits. The archers, highly professional and trained for accuracy, targeted these vulnerable points. Even when a full suit of armor was struck on the main plate, the energy transfer was devastating. An arrow that hit a breastplate dead-on could still cause a severe, life-threatening injury through blunt trauma. The sheer kinetic energy of a 100-pound draw bow, even if absorbed by the steel, could dent the plate inward sharply enough to break the ribs, puncture a lung, or cause fatal internal bleeding beneath the metal. The constant hail of arrows meant even a temporary lapse, a hand lifting a shield, a man stooping to prevent a visor hit exposed a new vulnerable seam. This constant, percussive damage ensured that even the safe knights were being relentlessly battered and wounded. The French advance was immediately complicated by the chaos of their own wounded, the screaming and falling of their horses, and the constant psychological terror of the relentless, whistling volleys. Even with the arrow deflected, the knight was already beaten. But the true enemy wasn't the bow, it was the ground itself. Crucially, the rain-soaked field did its part before the arrows even landed. The deep, churned mud, combined with the extreme weight of their armor and the sheer density of the French formation, slowed the advance to a painful crawl. Knights, who could normally charge across the field, were sinking up to their knees, exhausting themselves with every single step. Their carefully engineered, 60-pound defense system was now a crippling burden. The slower they moved, the longer they remained in the killing zone. The archers, unencumbered, could maintain their phenomenal rate of fire, ensuring that every few seconds, a new cascade of bodkins was launched toward the exhausted, stumbling French lines. The great steel wall did not break instantly. It was beaten into a quagmire, setting the stage for the final, bloody collapse. The French were not only slowed, but the simple act of marching in that mud doubled the energy expenditure required, draining their stamina before the first sword was even drawn. This lack of mobility meant the French could not break formation to avoid the heaviest volleys, compounding the damage. Share this video with a fellow history enthusiast if you believe this is a story that deserves to be told with this level of detail. Drop a comment below and tell us which other historical battle you'd like to see examined next. The field was no longer a battlefield, it was a bog, a slaughterhouse of entangled men and exhausted horses. The battle was about to devolve from a contest of projectiles into a desperate, close-quarters slugfest. The French charge had collapsed into a human traffic jam in the narrow gap. The combination of the narrow terrain, the deep mud, and the sustained arrow volleys had pushed the vanguard into an impassable, suffocating bottleneck. Knights were tripping over the palings, over fallen horses, and over their own wounded. Their primary weapon, the ability to deliver a massed, high-velocity impact, was negated. Instead, they were pressed together, unable to swing their heavy weapons, unable to even lift their feet from the sticky, sucking earth. The most advanced defense system in Europe had become a trap, turning the French nobility into exhausted, immovable targets, their armor now a suffocating prison. The sensory environment was pure hell. The smell of blood, fear, and human waste mixed with the sound of desperate shouting and the metallic clang of men trying to right themselves in the quagmire. The battle devolved into a brutal, close-quarters slugfest in the mud, where the superior engineering of the plate armor finally failed against the combined forces of exhaustion and the determined, unexpected aggression of the English common soldier. The English charge was devastatingly effective. Henry V, seeing the enemy immobilized, ordered his few professional men-at-arms forward. More devastatingly, the longbowmen, having exhausted their ready supply of arrows, dropped their bows and seized their secondary weapons, axes, mallets, lead-weighted mauls and swords. This was the terrifying transformation of the missile troop into shock infantry, driven by primal aggression and the smell of fear. The resulting melee was brutal. The longbowmen, agile, unencumbered by heavy armor and fueled by desperation, swarmed the immobilized French knights. The fight was not one of chivalry, it was one of desperate execution. The knights, already exhausted by the mud and battered by blunt trauma, were physically incapable of fighting at full strength, their muscles burning from the exertion of the march. The longbowmen, using their hammers and daggers weapons designed to pierce between armor plates, targeted the gaps in the armor. The steel shell of the plate armor was useless when its wearer was face down in the mud, pinned by the weight of his own expensive defense and surrounded by dozens of unarmored but aggressive commoners. The inability of the French lines to provide flanking support or relief troops sealed their fate, as the entire vanguard was systematically annihilated in the central choke point. The ensuing French defeat was absolute. The second and third battle lines, seeing the slaughter of their nobility, broke and fled, refusing to enter the narrow funnel of death. Henry V, trapped by a small French reserve force, was forced to make the infamous, desperate decision to order the execution of thousands of prisoners, not an act of cruelty, but one of pragmatic survival for his small, exhausted army who could not spare the men to guard them, especially with the French baggage train being raided nearby. The victory at Agincourt was not just a military upset, it was a profound, technical statement about the future of warfare. The dominance of the heavily armored feudal knight, the symbol of centuries of European power, was fundamentally challenged. The battle proved that the disciplined, professional common soldier, armed with a cheap, high rate of fire weapon and supported by effective tactical terrain use, could utterly annihilate the most expensive military force in the world. The lesson was clear. Technology mattered, but physics, volume, and tactical discipline mattered more. The age of the knight was far from over, but the ground beneath his steel-shod feet had just been permanently muddied. The siege of Agincourt is a powerful story of how desperation, a profound understanding of physics, and the unbelievable courage of ordinary people can overcome impossible odds. It proves that history isn't always made by the largest armies. but sometimes by the most effective technology wielded by the most desperate hands. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles and the science that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.